The money will be ours soon enough, just be patient. Those were the words I heard my own daughter whisper to her husband from the next room. My name is Margaret, and I'm 66 years old. I was quietly folding laundry, thinking it was just another evening, when her voice carried through the wall. At first I thought I misheard, but then she said it again, colder, sharper, as if my existence was nothing more than a burden. My blood froze. At that moment, the doorknob behind me began to turn, and I realized I wasn't alone. If you're hearing my story now, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far my story of betrayal and revenge has traveled. Comment below where you are watching from, because this is not just my story. It is the story of every parent who has poured out love, only to discover betrayal waiting in the shadows. The day I saw Catherine's true intentions, something in me shattered, and something else, sharper, colder, took its place. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I am 68 years old, a widow who once believed family was the one fortress that could never crumble. For 40 years I worked as a nurse, holding dying hands, stitching wounds, and promising strangers that they were not alone. At the end of every shift, I carried that same promise home to my children. Every sacrifice, every dollar saved, every sleepless night belonged to them. I thought that devotion was unbreakable, eternal. Charleston, South Carolina, is where my life has unfolded, in a Victorian house that has stood for generations. Its walls are lined with photographs of ancestors, its porch shaded by magnolia trees that bloom heavy with fragrance each spring. To me, this house is more than wood and brick. It is memory, sacrifice, legacy. Yet what I saw as sacred, my daughter Catherine began to see as a treasure chest. Where I saw a home, she saw an inheritance waiting to be claimed. Catherine is 39 now, a wife and mother, living in Atlanta in a house larger than her means, surrounded by things she cannot afford. But once she was a little girl with wildflowers in her hands and laughter in her voice, pressing notes of love into my palm. Somewhere along the years, sweetness hardened into calculation. When she looked at me, her eyes no longer softened with affection. They sharpened with the weight of numbers and deeds. She began visiting more often, her words cloaked in concern. She asked to review my bills, to streamline my accounts, to take burdens off my shoulders. At first I told myself this was love, expressed in practical care. But then I noticed her lingering gaze on documents, her pressing questions about the value of my home, her sharp tone whenever I hesitated. It was not love she brought through my door, it was control disguised as kindness. The night I finally understood her intentions, the house itself seemed to recoil. The portraits on the walls stared with silent accusation, as though generations whispered that I had been blind. I was not simply her mother anymore. To her, I was an obstacle standing between her and the wealth she had already counted as hers. I sat in the silence of my kitchen, the clock ticking like a metronome of betrayal, and I knew this story would not end in surrender. The mornings in Charleston became heavy with silence, the kind of silence that presses against your chest until it feels like breathing itself is work. I brewed tea in porcelain cups my husband and I once shared, their delicate rims now touched only by me. The pendulum clock in the hallway ticked without pause, its rhythm a cruel reminder that time moved forward even when my life stood still. My house echoed with memory, but memory was not company. I walked through the garden where magnolia blossoms opened beneath the sun, their scent thick in the humid air. Once, these flowers had been the backdrop to Catherine's laughter as she played beneath the trees, her hands sticky with lemonade, her hair tangled in ribbons. Now they were only witnesses to my solitude, nodding gently as if to console me. The garden had not betrayed me. It remained constant, while my daughter's heart had turned to stone. Evenings were the most difficult. The walls carried whispers of my husband's voice, and I sometimes set the table for two before catching myself in the act. The chair across from mine remained empty, a hollow reminder of what I had lost long before Catherine's greed surfaced. I would light candles to fight the shadows, but their glow only reminded me of how many meals I had eaten alone. Loneliness gnawed at me, not because of absence, but because of betrayal. Catherine's visits punctuated my solitude, her presence both a relief and a wound. She arrived with smiles practiced in the mirror, carrying bags of groceries or envelopes of mail as if to prove her usefulness, yet every gesture was marked by calculation. She asked how much I had saved, if the insurance from her father's death was still intact, whether I had considered simplifying ownership of the house. Each question was framed as concern, but I knew better. Her love was conditional, measured in dollars. I tried, in my weakness, to cling to the memory of who she once was. I reminded myself of bedtime stories, of scraped knees I had bandaged, of the soft arms that once wrapped around my neck. But the woman who sat before me now, sipping my tea and glancing at the family deeds on the desk, was not that child. She was someone else entirely, someone who wore her daughterhood like a mask while plotting to strip me of everything. It was during one of those visits, as her voice smoothed over my doubts and her smile urged me to comply, that I realized the depth of my mistake. My silence had not preserved peace, it had fed her hunger. Each time I swallowed my words, she grew bolder, more certain that I was powerless to resist. I looked at her across my kitchen table and knew this was not the end of her schemes. It was only the beginning. Stay with me until the end, and you will see how I turned her hunger into her downfall. I first saw the truth in a stack of papers left carelessly on the corner of my desk. Catherine had asked me to sign a few forms she described as routine, assurances for my protection. She smiled as she explained, her tone gentle, almost maternal in its performance, but when I looked closer, I saw words that chilled me: joint accounts, transfer of ownership, durable power of attorney. They were not safeguards, they were shackles disguised as kindness. When I asked her about it, her eyes shifted for the briefest moment, like a curtain twitching before a storm. She laughed, brushing my concern aside. "Mom, you're overthinking this. I only want to make things easier for you." Her voice was honey, but it stuck in my throat like poison. For the first time, I recognized that her visits, her questions, her sudden attentiveness had never been about care. They were steps in a silent heist. I replayed every conversation we had in recent months, and the puzzle came together with dreadful clarity. Each question about my savings, each suggestion about simplifying my accounts, each offer to handle my bills, it was all scaffolding for this moment. She had been building a tower of control, brick by brick, while I mistook her manipulations for love. Now I saw it plainly. Catherine did not want my well-being. She wanted my signature, my silence, and eventually my absence. The betrayal was not abstract. It was written in ink, in the language of contracts and authority. I held those papers in trembling hands and felt a surge of anger stronger than grief. To raise a daughter, to give her everything, and to have her return not with gratitude but with deception. It was a cruelty deeper than any wound I had seen in a hospital bed. This was not neglect, it was calculated theft, cloaked in the name of family. I placed the papers back on the desk, my face a mask of calm. She believed I would fold under the weight of her persuasion, as I always had before. But inside, something hardened. I no longer saw her as my daughter seated at my table. I saw her as an intruder in my home, a stranger wearing my child's face, and I swore silently that she would never steal what I had bled to build. That night, as the clock struck 10 and the house settled into stillness, I sat in the parlor staring at the documents she had left behind. I could hear the faint hum of cicadas outside, the scent of magnolia drifting through the open window. My world had narrowed to a single truth. Catherine's love was an illusion, and her mask had begun to crack. I promised myself then that the next move would be mine, and she would never see it coming. The night after Catherine left those documents on my desk, I sat in the dim glow of a single lamp, staring at the papers as though they might burst into flames under my gaze. My tears had dried, leaving behind something harder, something unyielding. For years I had mistaken silence for strength, endurance for dignity. But in that moment I realized endurance without action is nothing but surrender. I would not surrender my life to a daughter who saw me as her bank. I thought of the decades I had worked as a nurse, the nights I spent walking hospital halls, whispering comfort to strangers who gasped their last breaths. I had been strong for them, steady even in the face of death. And yet, when it came to Catherine, I had folded again and again, too afraid to admit the truth. My silence had not protected peace, it had fed her ambition. Now, my silence would end. When she looked at me, she saw a frail woman nearing 70, a widow clinging to her memories. She saw weakness, vulnerability, a gate easily opened with the right pressure. What she failed to see was that I still had steel in my spine and fire in my blood. I had survived grief, loss, and years of labor that nearly broke me. What was one more battle, especially when it was for the only thing I had left? My dignity? I began to study her, not with the love of a mother, but with the scrutiny of an enemy. I memorized the cadence of her lies, the tilt of her head when she grew impatient, the way her smile faltered when she felt challenged. Each detail became a note etched into my mind, a record of the cracks in her facade. I knew that if I waited, she would expose herself further, and when she did, I would be ready. The magnolia trees in my garden became the keepers of my new resolve. As I watered them at dusk, I whispered words I had never dared speak before. She thinks I am weak. She thinks I am blind. But one day she will see me as I truly am. The fragrance of the blossoms mingled with the bitterness in my chest, reminding me that beauty can hide thorns sharp enough to bleed. I was not done. I was only beginning. That night I opened a leather-bound journal, one that had belonged to my late husband, and I began to write. Not memories, not grief, but evidence. Every cruel remark, every probing question, every document she pushed across the table. I filled the pages not with sorrow but with ammunition. For the first time in years, I felt not powerless, but prepared. Catherine believed she had cornered me. She did not know she had awakened something she could never contain. The first step of my plan was secrecy. I scheduled an appointment with an attorney in downtown Charleston, careful not to let Catherine suspect. His office smelled of leather and dust, walls lined with law books worn by years of desperate hands. I placed the documents on his desk, explaining what my daughter had attempted. He adjusted his glasses, eyes narrowing as he read. His words confirmed what I already knew. If I had signed, I would have surrendered everything. I left his office with a folder of new papers tucked firmly under my arm. We revised my will, secured my accounts, and placed protections on the house that had stood in my family for generations. No transfer, no manipulation, no signature could strip me of what was mine now. For the first time, I felt the balance shift, the weight of control returning to my hands. My home was no longer her prize, it was my fortress. Still, I knew that paper and ink alone would not destroy Catherine's illusions. She had woven a narrative for years, convincing not only herself but others that she was the dutiful daughter caring for her aging mother. To tear that mask away, I needed patience and a stage where she could expose herself without my interference. I thought long and hard about when she was most reckless, when her tongue loosened, when she sought admiration. The answer was clear: family gatherings. Thanksgiving was approaching, and Catherine had already insisted on hosting in her grand Atlanta home. She loved nothing more than presenting her life as polished perfection. Crystal glasses, expensive wine, dishes she pretended to prepare herself. Surrounded by friends, relatives, and her husband's colleagues, she played the role of devoted wife and loving daughter with flawless precision. That would be the night. I would not shout. I would not accuse. I would only place her in the spotlight she craved and let the cracks appear. While I waited, I rehearsed. In the quiet of my Charleston home, I sat before the mirror, practicing restraint. My voice had to remain calm, my words measured, my silence deliberate. I tended the magnolia trees as if they were confidants, whispering my plans to them under the heavy southern sky. Each petal seemed to absorb my resolve, each root anchoring me deeper in my conviction. I was no longer the mother desperate for love. I was the strategist preparing for war. I wrote everything in my husband's old journal, its pages filling with evidence, reflections, and reminders of what was at stake. This was not only about protecting assets, it was about reclaiming the respect I had allowed to erode under years of manipulation. Catherine thought she was circling her inheritance like a hawk. What she did not realize was that I had become something sharper, something far less forgiving. The trap was set. She would walk into it willingly. Thanksgiving arrived with the crisp air of late November, but inside Catherine's Atlanta home, the atmosphere was suffocating with staged perfection. The dining table gleamed with polished silverware and crystal glasses, the kind she loved to showcase. Candles flickered, and guests filled the room with laughter and admiration. She moved among them like a hostess in a play, her every gesture rehearsed, her smile a weapon. To them, she was elegance. To me, she was artifice about to collapse. I sat near the end of the table, hands folded neatly, my eyes patient. Catherine filled glasses, touching her husband's shoulder lightly, ensuring every observer saw the performance of devotion. She leaned close to me, whispering, "Mom, aren't you glad we can all be together like this?" I gave her a thin smile, one that concealed the storm within me. Tonight was not about answering her words. Tonight was about waiting for her to reveal herself. The dinner unfolded with the usual choreography, toast after toast, laughter over the turkey, compliments traded like currency. Catherine thrived in the spotlight, and I let her bask in it. She raised her glass, voice ringing clear, saying Daniel owes much of his success to my guidance. Her eyes sought approval, but I chose that moment to tilt my head and ask, calm and deliberate, "Why don't you tell everyone again how you secured those opportunities for him?" The room stilled as Forks paused mid-air. For a second, the mask slipped. Catherine's smile wavered before she forced a laugh. "Oh, I didn't mean it like that," she stammered. "I just helped him along the way." But her words contradicted tales she had told before, stories of influence and connections she claimed to control. Guests exchanged glances, confusion stirring. I said nothing more, only held her gaze with the weight of truth pressing against her fragile performance. Her voice rose slightly, the polished tone cracking under strain. She insisted on her indispensability, on how none of this would have been possible without her intervention. The more she spoke, the less convincing she became. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes, his silence heavier than words. I could see the tension ripple through the room as her charm dissolved, leaving behind only the sharpness she had hidden so well. Catherine was no longer the perfect hostess. She was a desperate woman clawing to maintain her mask. I remained still, composed, my hands folded in my lap as the storm raged around her. I did not accuse. I did not shout. I simply let her drown in the contradictions she had woven. When her voice faltered and the last of her false laughter died in her throat, the silence that followed was more powerful than any speech I could have made. In that silence, her mask fell, and everyone present saw her not as she pretended to be, but as she truly was. The silence that followed Catherine's unraveling was louder than any outburst could have been. Forks rested untouched on plates, wine glasses stood half-raised, and even the candles seemed to flicker uneasily as if reacting to the tension. Guests shifted in their chairs, eyes darting between Catherine and me, but no one dared to speak first. In that stillness, I felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders. For the first time she was exposed not by my accusations, but by her own words. Catherine tried to recover, her voice trembling as she laughed nervously. She muttered about being misunderstood, about how she only wanted the best for everyone. But her tone betrayed her, brittle and sharp. The audience she had once held so firmly was slipping away from her grasp, and she knew it. Her husband looked down at his plate, unwilling to intervene, while Daniel's silence was as heavy as lead. She stood alone in the ruin she had built herself. One by one, the guests began to excuse themselves. Some claimed early mornings, others long drives back home. Their excuses were polite, but their eyes carried discomfort and judgment. The feast Catherine had crafted as a display of power had ended in disgrace, plates left unfinished, and conversations cut short. Her carefully staged evening had collapsed into whispers that would follow her long after the last candle was extinguished. The humiliation she had once reserved for me was now her own burden. Daniel finally raised his eyes to mine. There was no apology in his gaze, only confusion and recognition. Perhaps he was beginning to see the truth he had ignored for so long. Perhaps not. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Silence was still his shield, but this time it did not protect Catherine. It only made her fall more apparent. I no longer needed his defense. I had defended myself. Catherine disappeared into the kitchen, her footsteps echoing like gunshots across the tile. I heard the slam of a cabinet door, the clatter of silverware thrown too hard into a sink. I remained seated at the table, calm, composed, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I had no desire to chase her or to argue. The battle was over, and the silence she could not control was the verdict she had feared most. Her mask had fallen, and it would not return. When the last guest left and the house finally quieted, I stood and smoothed the fabric of my dress. The candles had burned low, wax dripping like pale rivers across the tablecloth. I blew them out one by one, each extinguished flame a reminder of an illusion destroyed. In the darkness that followed, I felt no regret, no fear, only clarity. Catherine had been unmasked before the very people she sought to impress, and I was still standing, stronger than ever. In the days after Thanksgiving, the silence in my home felt different. It was no longer the silence of humiliation, but of consequence. I had exposed Catherine, stripped her of the mask she wore so proudly, yet victory came at a cost I could not ignore. The phone rang less often. Relatives who once visited with smiles now sent guarded messages or none at all. I had reclaimed my dignity, but in the process, I had become untouchable in another way. Daniel called only once that week. His voice was heavy, his words hesitant. He spoke of work deadlines, of how the children were doing in school, but he never mentioned the dinner, never spoke Catherine's name. I could hear the strain in his pauses, the tension of a man caught between blood and loyalty. When I asked if he was well, he answered too quickly, and I knew he was not. Silence had once been his defense. Now it was his prison. Catherine herself vanished from my life. No visits, no calls, no carefully packaged concern. Her absence was both a relief and a wound. For years, she had filled my home with her presence, even if it was poisoned by manipulation. Now the absence was clean, empty, but sharp in its finality. She had chosen her greed over me, and when her plan failed, she chose distance. It was, in its own way, the confirmation I had dreaded most. Whispers began to circle among the wider family. Some painted me as cruel, unforgiving, a mother too proud to reconcile. Others quietly admired my resolve but avoided saying it aloud. I could feel their judgments in the way conversations ended when I entered a room, in the sideways glances at gatherings. Reputation, like glass, shatters easily. Mine was no longer the gentle widow holding a family together. I was now the woman who had destroyed her daughter at the dinner table. At night, I sat by the pendulum clock in the hallway, listening to its steady rhythm. I thought of the years I had sacrificed, the childhood I had given Catherine, the woman she had chosen to become. Was my vengeance worth this fracture? The answer echoed in the ticking clock. To remain silent would have been to vanish entirely. To act had cost me the illusion of closeness, but it had preserved something more vital, my self-respect. So I bore the weight of consequence with the same strength I had carried into every battle before. I had held strangers as they took their final breaths. I could hold this silence too. Catherine had lost her chance to love me honestly, and I had lost the daughter I thought I had raised. But I had not lost myself, and in the hollow stillness of my Charleston home, that truth was enough to steady me. The memory of that Thanksgiving table remains etched in my mind, the moment when Catherine's mask slipped and she stood revealed before all who once admired her. The silver gleamed, the candles flickered, and yet all eyes were fixed on her unraveling. That was the night she lost the power she had so carefully cultivated, and that was the night I stopped being her victim. It was not victory I felt, but clarity, a truth that could never again be hidden. Back in Charleston, my house seemed to breathe differently. The magnolia trees swayed in the evening breeze, their blossoms nodding as if in solemn approval. I walked the halls where portraits of ancestors looked down at me, no longer with silent accusation, but with recognition. I had preserved what mattered most, not the wealth Catherine craved, but the dignity she tried to strip from me. My legacy was intact, not because she guarded it, but because I had defended it myself. I often wondered if she lay awake at night, replaying that dinner, hearing the silence that had judged her louder than words ever could. Did she remember the way her husband looked away? The way Daniel's silence no longer shielded her but condemned her? Did she see me in her mind, calm and composed, refusing to break? If she did, perhaps she understood then that greed cannot survive the weight of truth. If not, her denial was punishment enough. The cost was real, and I do not deny it. I lost the daughter I thought I had raised, the one who once pressed wildflowers into books and whispered, "I love you," with sticky hands and a child's sincerity. But that girl had long ago vanished, replaced by a woman who saw only numbers where love should be. By exposing her, I had buried the illusion for good. Painful as it was the only way to survive intact. Now, when I sit at my kitchen table, I do so without tears. The porcelain cups are steady in my hands, the clock ticks without cruelty, and the silence no longer weighs like chains. She was my daughter, but all she wanted was my money. Now she has neither. And I, though marked by scars, have something far more enduring, the proof that I refused to be erased. That truth steadies me in a way her false affection never could. If you have lived through betrayal, if you have given everything only to find yourself stripped by those you loved most, then you understand the wound I carry. Share your thoughts in the comments because silence shared becomes strength. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, stories of masks torn away and truths laid bare, stay with me. Subscribe, listen, and remember, survival is not just endurance, it is reclaiming the self that others tried to destroy.